And we've been talking about the prison industrial complex and mass incarceration up here in the context of how it appears to us today, but we also have to recognize that this comes from somewhere, right? Like, this isn't anything new, and mass incarceration has been going on here on Turtle Island in so-called America since the beginning of invasion. So I'm wondering if any of the panelists want to talk at all about the mass incarceration of Indigenous people.
Well, something really important is to go back to history and realize how this country was built. Right now in the United States and in Canada, we have the so-called like Indigenous reservations. You know, like we think a little bit about that, and we know the history about that. You know, before all this land, before all these reservations were like naming in that way, you know, the name for these places were prisoners of war camp. You know, that's the reality of those places right now. You know, the fact like from being prisoners of war camps to being like called reservations right now is an erase of history. That's the reality of that. If you go to different communities, you know, and I have different friends and relatives living in these places, you know, I always hear about like how Navy people in the United States, you know, are the only ones that have a number different than the Social Security number. They call the number the war number, the prisoner number. You know, every single like Indigenous nation, you know, Indigenous people in this continent, you know, like have that, you know, and that's the history, you know, how like the state has been using that tool, you know, mass incarceration, you know, and repression in Indigenous communities. And also the fact like the police, you know, the police force in the South, you know, are the direct descendant of white vigilante groups, you know, to keep like black people in check, you know, to make them behave, you know. So there is like a reality, a strong, you know, emphasis, you know, for me on white supremacy and control of these different populations.
Yeah, I just want to add to that a little bit because I think it's really important that you like talk about like the idea of mass incarceration being like initial roundups in order to like create like what was the inception of apartheid like on Turtle Island that later was studied by other systems of like, if you know, for like Hitler came here and was all like, what y'all doing with that Navajo nation, because we want to replicate that, you know. And then South Africa and the ways in which things happen in Australia also, you know, revolutionized the ability to commit genocide in a more efficient way. And the entire state of Oklahoma was just meant to be a prisoner camp, you know, for Indigenous people. And the whole longest walk stuff, this constant relocation, scorcher campaigns, the conquest of the West, all of it, you know. And for me, like, and then also too, like in the formal abolition of slavery, like before that time, the majority of prisoners were not black. And then as soon as slavery is ended, you know, because it still continues today in various forms, and suddenly you have a huge influx of black folks as prisoner populations. So it's not coincidental. And so for me to connect that, like between the prison industrial complex and the academic industrial complex, what that says is that these spaces are not meant for us. We are unwanted and we are not meant to be here. We are supposed to be exterminated. We're not even supposed to be alive. The fact that we're here and breathing, you know, is an act of resistance, and I want to celebrate all of us together in that moment, you know? Like, we should all just give each other a round of applause for talking about lives. That's for a colonizer. Right? No. But, you know, and this is something I talked about before in the past with, I think it's really important that we that whole notion of the ivory tower, right? People colloquially call university that. They don't call it that for nothing. It's a pillar of white supremacy, and the ways in which that knowledge production is understood, like for me, like Indigenous ways of knowing and being are directly undermined and are said to be illegitimate within a Eurocentric knowledge framework. So this idea of, you know, a lot of things are So it's just, and just to unpack that, like indigenous ways of knowing and being, so for instance, not separating ourselves from the natural world, you know, and just like the ways in which that indigenous sciences and indigenous knowledge are constantly being co-opted or undermined or like seen as like taboo or savage and all of these things in order to stop us from practicing our own medicines, from being able to be self-sufficient, and then to later, I mean, for instance, you know, like so much penicillin, you know, like there's so many examples that my brain is overflowing and I can't even articulate any of them, but there's just so many things that are being upheld, you know, and it's once there is a way to commodify the knowledge and put it within a private sector in order to corporatize it, then we can like acknowledge these things as like these are scientific and they're moving forward in a good way. And I'll tell you, you know, like uranium-235, which is what is enriched uranium when we enrich it for the fuel fabrication process, that element only naturally exists in a supernova. So I don't think that there's anything like really natural about the way that the Eurocentric scientific system goes. In fact, as far as I'm concerned, that was born out of like mid-19th century moves towards eugenics. You know, and so eugenic experimentation and like forced sterilization of indigenous women, of black women, of women of color, the active incarceration and stigmatization of mental health for queer folks, you know, all of this is part of the process of eugenics in order to find like, you know, this master raceable stuff, you know, this entire agenda, right? So that was kind of like a little bit all over, most articulated, but I just wanted to add to it.